On the hobby bench today, I'll be painting up Doctor Strange for Marvel Crisis Protocol. So I've got Doctor Strange here I'm going to be tackling with the Vallejo Xpress contrast, and I painted down white over his skin. I'm also going to be painting down white for his cape, just on the edges of the cape and the sash, just for that yellow there. And I'm not too sure how I'm going to do this arcane circle. I have to sort of figure that out. I have to play around with that a little bit. I mostly want to stress out really for the cape and stuff like that. Make sure you give it a really good dry brush of white over a gray primer. I'm using fairy skin here. And so the difference when I say about laying down the contrast for that and the base of that, your typical contrast work great over a gray primer, then you dry brush it white, especially let's say in the back of the cape. That's definitely going to bring out that small change in color there that allow those contrasts to work. But for some of the contrast paints I noticed from Vallejo, they're a little transparent. And fairy skin is especially a good example of that. I think also maybe the yellows. And so here is odd enough that I really think that a base coat of white will probably work best for that. So I'm pretty much going to go ahead and carefully go through sections on his face, just give a nice even coat as much as I can with this fairy skin. And it's pretty transparent. I realize now really working with a white undercoat, that's really what works best. So I'm just giving a good coat and trying to get everything over the surface of that. Now I've got to apologize too I have to apologize too working on this video. It's an odd miniature. There's really some odd angles in it. And so I was flipping that around a lot, trying to get underneath it and where I needed to go. And sometimes I think camera just didn't quite capture the action I wanted. Now I've gone through after it's dried, I'm going to use some sepia ink. And that's going to bring out quite a bit of depth in the model there. And those little cracks and crevices on his hands and on his cheeks and stuff like that, and then his eyes, it's going to allow that ink to pool up and bring out a little bit of texture. So I'm just going to give it a nice coat of sepia ink. And I didn't wash this out very well. It's pretty much undilute. So we're going to see how it looks. I'm just, as I said, trying new things out. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, but we'll see how it goes. So I've got that dried out. It's a little ruddier than I like, so I'm going to have to work on that. The next thing I'm going to be using is Mystic Blue. Here, just giving a nice simple coat over his top part of his jacket here, of his costume. And I think it leaves a very lovely color. It's a nice deep blue. And so I'm just carefully going through here and trying to avoid his chest emblem a little bit. I'm going to go back with that a little bit later with some Templar White. It's just like a little bit of an off-white color. I think that works very well. But this Mystic Blue is a nice color. It's fairly deep blue, and they have these lovely folds in his costume there that when you just dry brush it out, it really does add quite a bit of texture for that. And you can see here on his pants and such, again, it's got these lovely folds in there, and we get that dry brushing of that white. This just really allows this contrast paint to work very well with that foundation of that. And just carefully going through sections, just one at a time, just give a nice even coat. That's the best way to work with these contrast paints. Make sure you just don't let that set aside and dry. You want to try to make sure that you're going through the model as evenly as possible. So now I'm going to move back onto Plasma Red. It's a very bright red, and I'm just going to go as well as I can. And here, as I mentioned, it's got this unusual model, trying to get the angles that I needed to. Bending it around is really sort of hard to get on the camera, so I apologize on that. I'll probably switch vantages pretty soon. But here especially, you just want to give a nice even coat as evenly as possible, trying to go back over the sections that you have as much as you can. Now I'm going to have little whoopsies here and there on the edges and that piping of his cape. That just sort of happens sometimes. So you can always go back and just paint that over white. And you can see on the back here, now I'm just going to give a little bit better of an angle there. And as you can see already, it's got these lovely, lovely shade of red. Folds into the cloak pretty well. And I think having that dry brush, that just adds just the right amount of change in the color to bring that out. It's a little hard to do sometimes with blending and stuff like that, just with contrast paint alone. So I think that, using the slop chop, using that dry brush of white, that really helps accentuate that model features quite a bit. And there you go. And you can see that, those upper folds, with that, having that dry brush of white, that really just adds that small change in color that allows this contrast to work. And overall, I think it looks pretty good. So now we're going to move on to the piping of his cape. And for that, I'm going to be using Imperial Yellow. And as I mentioned before, I used a white undercoat for that. It's a pretty transparent color. So in other models, again, I mentioned that I have with my Iron Fist model that I painted up, there I used a different color of yellow as a base coat. And, having this Imperial Yellow over that really, really made it pop. So I'm just going to cut some corners here and just pretty much use just white. And just carefully go through as much as I can, trying not to get into the other areas I have. And again, if you have a little bit of whoopsies, you just go back, a little bit of gray and white if you need to, and then you just repaint those sections if possible. These things sort of happen, but you just want to try to be as careful as possible. It's really got a nice color for those. But I have to say that, because of that undercoat of white, that works out really well for most part, maybe on the edges of the cape and stuff like that, but I want to make that stand out a little bit more. So now I'm going to move back into some more traditional acrylic colors. Here I'm going to be using transparent yellow. And for this, I'm just going to go ahead and just try to do some edge highlights and just sort of carefully go through as much as I can for maybe some of the raised areas. Especially I want to say on his sash. It's got quite a bit of folds and stuff like that. And unfortunately, that yellow just doesn't really add much depth or texture to the color gradients in that. So having this like a highlight of yellow really helps make that stand out. So I'm going to be working on that quite a bit, just sort of getting the edges and all that. Now I want to make that stand out just a little bit more. So I'm going to go back again with another yellow here. I'm going to use deep yellow. This is a lighter shade, and I'm going to just be trying again, doing a little bit of some gentle touch-ups and some gentle highlights, just a couple places here and there, maybe on the edge of the cape, but really mostly focusing on his sash and on his belt, because I think it has those folds in there, and you really want to make those stand out a little bit more. So that's why I'm going to be using these additional yellow colors. This will add some texture, if you will, to this model in doing that. You can show here that I'm just going to the edge of the cape. And here I'm just using the side of the brush pretty much. I'm just going to carefully go along the edge of the cape itself. So, that sharp edge of the corner of that cape, where you have the fold from the very bottom to maybe the top of the model there. That's when I'm sort of going to be going along very carefully, just that edge there. And that's something I think that would naturally catch some light. So I want to make that just a little bit more of a lighter color of yellow. And that's what I'm just doing here, just to add a bit of highlight, just to give it a little bit more life. And there we go. Now I've shown here that I didn't paint off on his other leggings a storm blue. And I also mentioned that I used Templar White for his upper emblem. So it looks pretty good, and I'm happy with that. But I'm going to have to go back to the skin. It's just a little too ruddy for me. So I'm going to be using a mix of Dark Flesh, the acrylic paint, and also going back with Fairy Skin, the contrast paint. And pretty much a 50-50 mix of those two. And here I'm just going to go through and just try to get some highlights over his face. I'm just going to go to the forehead and cheekbones and his nose. And the idea here is I want to leave that original color, if I can, on his hairline and on the recesses of his eyes and stuff like that. I mean, I think it adds a natural shade. But I want to I guess get rid of that ruddy color a little bit and just add a little bit more of a paler texture skin. And here again, the key thing is just really try to pick out the highlights of the face that you normally have. Maybe the jutting part of his chin, along his jawline, and getting along his cheekbones and his bridge of his nose, maybe a little bit of his upper lip. These are things you think that would be a little bit more of a lighter color. And so that's what I'm just going to carefully work on. And this will just sort of transition quite a bit and soften that. And the same thing for his hands. I'm going to just try to go on maybe the outside of his palm of his hand. And, of course, highlighting all his individual fingers. Just trying to leave maybe those little crevices in his fingers in the way that they're closed up. You try to leave that the original color if I can, because it's naturally dark. And so I want to try to keep that original shade there and just sort of highlight around it. It's a little hard to do. It's a little tricky, especially this paintbrush that I have. I'm just going to try to carefully go through that as much as I can. I think you can sort of see the difference there. If you're looking at his right hand, it has that lighter shade, as opposed to his left hand, which has the original color, which looks all right, but it's just a little too much of a ruddy chestnut color for me. So I really wanted to add a bit more of a lighter shade. So I've got that done. It looks pretty good, gives the nice highlights I want. Now I'm going to work on his hair, try to work on his mustache, but well, first, looks like I have to give somebody some attention. Okay, cat break is over. So I just painted up his hair and his mustache with black. And unfortunately, I didn't have a really super thin brush, so I think that mustache is a little bit more Magnum PI than probably Doctor Strange. But now I'm going to be moving on to his arcane circle. And for that one, I'm going to be using Orc Skin. Now, I wanted to try something a little bit different with this arcane circle. Now, I guess you've taken the comics or maybe the movies, it's just really bright orange, yellow. But I found, let's say, if you recall from the video I've done with Blade, I feel sometimes that you might want to use a little bit more of a subtle color because I really want to make the figure stand out. And if this is like a bright orange or a bright yellow, pretty much I think you're looking at the arcane circle all meshing in maybe with, the figure itself. And I really wanted to make Doctor Strange stand out a little bit prominently. So I'm going to try something a little bit different here. I'm going to just be using this Orc Skin contrast paint and just really carefully go through this, give it a nice coat. This is here, I think, the advantage of working with these contrast paints because they flow pretty well. Unlike maybe a traditional paint where I might have to use 2 or 3 coats, here I can get a really good even coverage pretty quickly. It does cover pretty well. It flows pretty well over the model itself, imparts a fair amount of color as opposed to maybe working with a traditional paint. Not quite the even coverage that you necessarily would want, but I think it works out well. And so there you go, I've got that base. Now I really want to highlight that out a little bit more. And so typically you want to think is that, okay, you're going to just dry brush it a lighter color. But here I want to try something a little different. I want to make it look a little off, a little different than maybe what you'd normally be expecting. So I'm actually going to be using a darker shade here. So here what I'm going to be using is medium olive. And the idea here, again, as I mentioned, is, rather than what you typically would think of is a upper surfaces having a lighter color and looking a little bit more natural for me, I want to make this look a little unnatural, a little bit odd. There's something a little bit off with this. And that I'm doing that, I'm going to be using the darker dry brush. And I think this is the way they make it look a little bit otherworldly. Maybe I would think like an arcane circle. There's something that doesn't look right, doesn't look very natural. And this is what I'm trying to capture a little bit. So I'm using basically a light color as a base coat and then just using a dry brush of a darker green. And I think that this will just add some type of change in color over the natural surfaces, things that you think it would capture light that really aren't capturing light by having that darker shade, and just make it look a little odd. And here you go. I think it looks pretty good. It looks a little different from the normally I want. Just a little bit more of a muted color. And you have those other areas underneath it that'll be a little bit lighter. But I really want to make this stand out. So I'm going to give it a little bit more of a highlight in one areas. Now, typically I want to maybe work over his shoulder and stuff like that, but I really don't want to get into his cape or have to go back with that. So I'm going to be a little lazy and use a different angle here. And this, I'm going to be going back to lime green. And I'm going to be doing more traditional highlight here. And so the idea is to maybe have some areas here that just sort of a shimmering surface, maybe something that's maybe rotating around or just, something that's going to sort of break that up a little bit. So I'm just going to be focusing on one area. And I'm going to carry that same angle through for all the other parts of these arcane circles. I'm just trying to be a little careful here and maybe not get too much into the depths and recesses of that model. And especially I think it's a little bit harder here on this lower one, the angle that I've got, that you've got this long extracted segment of the arcane circle. But I'm pretty much going to go ahead and just dry brush everything there if I can. And then going to work on the different circles that we've got down in the bottom. Again, just trying to keep that same angle there. And just, give this dry brush of this lighter green. That's just going to add something a little bit more to, I guess you could say, this a bland model surface there. Carefully, you just want to make sure when you're working on this that you're not necessarily getting in other parts of the model. So I'm using a filbert brush here that's just been torn to hell. It's a little bit more of a flatter edge. And I'm just going to try to work those bristles into the surface there. Try not to dig too deep into there and get into those recesses. What I really want to have is those original colors, and just try to focus on the surface of that. Of course, I'm working a little bit more up on the top, just doing the same thing. You just want to be sort of careful here and try to maintain that same angle if you can, just by eyeballing it here, so that it sort of carries through pretty uniformly of that. Just sort of keep dry brushing on that and keep working on that. So I want to say that it's a rather flat side of the models on each half there. So I think, if you're looking at the front side, you'll quickly flip over to the back of the side. There's really not much of a transition between the two. So if you're off a little bit on the angle there, I don't think it'd be that much of an issue. So I've got him painted up. I think it looks pretty good. Now I want to add just a bit more of a highlight to that. So I'm going to be mixing transparent yellow with lime green. And the idea here is just to give it a little bit more of a lighter color of green in the center there of that. And just sort of add just a small amount of lighter shade, just to, I think, add more of a lighter highlight and make that stand out just a little bit more. And so this is going to be just a very soft touch that I'm going to have. And so you can see there, let's say on the right side of that model, I've got that center part of that circle there. I'm just going to go ahead and just go through and just gently give it a light dry brush. And I'm just really light strokes here, covering it in the back and on the side, and not doing it too heavily. And the idea here is just to give that small accent of color. And I think that will just really make those highlights of that circle stand out so much more. And I was talking about that, fortunately, there's a flat side of the model, so really it's a big transition between the front and back. It's a little bit different. And I think already they can sort of see there that, this adds that little bit of subtle texture and color that I think really works out pretty well for the model. And so I think it looks pretty good. It's got a little bit of an otherworldly look, and I like it, but I gotta admit, it needs a little bit more. So what I'm gonna try to do is, you've got this really intricate, ornate part of the model, this arcane circle here, a lot of these odd symbols. So I wanna make it stand out just a little bit more in there. I think that would really make it look pretty cool. So I'm gonna use fluorescent green. And the idea here is I don't want to paint up each individual symbol, but I wanna try to capture the edges of that. So I'm just gonna be very carefully here, going in and just, going over most of the edges if I can. And this is a little bit of an intricate area here. It takes a while. I sort of have to make sure I get both sides of that. And so this is quite, a little labor intensive, but I want to carefully go through that. And already that's what you can sort of see. I think that's the idea, is I want to make it, this is probably more of a traditional highlight, but I think in combination with the outside of these circles and the way they look, I think that this will make it work pretty well. The key part here, though, I want to make sure is that those areas that I have highlighted, onto the sides of the circles with that lime green, I want to leave that blank. I don't want to highlight those. I want to sort of show there's just an odd shimmering change in this arcane circle behind him to make it look a little bit odd, a little bit off. But I just want to make sure that this doesn't be completely uniform behind there. I want to break that up some. And so I'm just carefully go through the edges as much as possible for this. And this will also add a little bit more of a highlight and sort of bring out those details, especially for those lower circles. They're not quite as intricate. So I think having those large spindles, pinning up the edges of those works out. And I think that this adds a small little touch to that. And I think that's what sort of makes it work, is that, you have this traditional highlight going on, but most of the circles a little bit different, with the idea that this lighter shade with a dry brush of a darker color. So, something looks a little bit off. And I think that that's what I really want to try to capture with this. And I think it looks pretty cool, a little bit different with that. This takes up quite a bit of time, and you just want to be very patient, be very careful, and just try not to get rushing it up and anything of that sort, because, that's when you can just really you have to have so much work to probably clean it up. So you just want to be very careful with this. And, that's it. So for the base, I use Lancer Gray just to pick out the cracks and then went through the upper curve there. And then I just dry brush that again with a craft acrylic paint. And I like it. I think it looks really well. Maybe I could go back and do a bit more object source lighting, maybe on the base somewhat for that arcane circle. But I really like the way this looks here. Your eye is just really drawn more towards the figure by using maybe just a subtle shade of this green. It's not really standing out too well. You can look at the back there. I just really like the way that cape, turned out. And the key, of course, there is just using that dry brush of white over that gray primer. Just adds that texture, that foundation that it makes that color contrast paints work, especially on these big flat surfaces there. So that's it. I'm pretty happy the way he turned out. I think, working these contrast paints, it looked pretty good. And of course, you're getting that arcane circle. It looks great. Of course, he's got that Magnum PI mustache, and I sort of like it. Overall, I'm really happy with him. This wraps up my Defenders list, so can't wait to get them to the tabletop.